had these discussions and they've been very energizing and engaging, and a lot of different viewpoints have come about. So that's what we're here for. I don't need to tell you about blockchain. You guys are very much educated. Some of you, I heard in the break, don't believe in such powers, spiritual powers of blockchain. So my job here is to convince you of such. When I see the entire space, and you've had a lot of discussion on different use cases of blockchain. So I have two models here that I use to understand what can blockchain be applied for. As a foundational technology, it becomes very difficult sometimes to understand, well, is it being applied for this or that, or what is the real extent of its impact. So if you look at the screen, on the right side, you will see that blockchain is able to replace old technology stack and reduce technical debt. It can improve inefficient business processes. And it can also reconfigure partner relationships across different supply chains. And it can be the shared layer of trust amongst different supply chains. All those, to me, are in the tactical area of its application. If you start moving into developing new products, meeting consumers where they are, and going into newer markets, recreating industries, recreating verticals, and eventually creating new business models in new markets, that's where you get to the strategic impact of blockchain. So keep in mind this view when you're looking at various use cases and see which side of this chart are we really talking about. That'll help you hone into its potential return on investment. And also, one of the principles, as we talk about those, in the blockchain space, you'll hear about a lot of use cases and you'll say, well, that'll never work. So maybe that doesn't work in the current state. And as I talk to a lot of different executives, I see a clear distinction. There are people who view this world from a current state point of view. Their vision and their vantage point is how things are today versus how things could be in the future. And that's the chasm we have to cross. Here's another model which puts a different spin and helps you identify categories of use cases. So it could be used to reduce infrastructure costs, because we can get from more centralized version of infrastructure to more distributed or more decentralized, depending on the use case. Or we can get to authenticate transactions, which we spend a lot of time, energy, effort, systems, people to authenticate today. We could protect intellectual property in the ways that we have not done in the world as of yet. And we can verify the chain of custody of an asset. An asset could be anything, we'll talk in detail about that. Or we can transfer digital or physical assets, and by that we mean digitizing physical assets and making them into tokens, and that's the world we're eventually going to live in. As we get into the healthcare space, let's take a quick poll here, since you all are resident experts in that area, and you know, I would love to know, having heard so many of these discussions, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you think there is application for blockchain in the healthcare space, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst? Where do you think we are? From 1 to 5, anybody?
Where we're at.
Where we're at today.
Oh,
1 to 5, okay. And from 5 to 10? Okay. Okay. In terms of your own understanding of how, see, you live in this environment much better than some outsider coming and telling you, you experience the space day in and day out. So when you learn more about what blockchain can and cannot do, you then think about, well, maybe there are areas, problem spaces that we could apply this to. Do you see some problem spaces that it is a very good fit for? Or do you see that this is all hogwash and, you know, there's this guy in the turban and beard trying to, you know, explain and convince me of something, and I might just listen because he has a turban, he must know what he's saying. So
it's not like a bow tie, you know. Go ahead.
Where do you think your own thinking lies? Is it bullshit and people are just selling you scams? Is it, you know, snake oil salesmen trying to get you to invest into their crypto tokens? Or is there some real world advantages here that you will see in the next few years in your practice?
So I'm going to ask a question. So the people who answered immediately, I just noticed, were people who are in healthcare but are in the computer back end, like the technology aspect of it. And as someone who is a physician who practices it, I'd like to know what the application would be for blockchain, because I'm just curious to know
Right.
to be able to answer that question.
Right. We'll get to that in 1 minute once we get some opinions. Yes, please.
So I've read a lot about blockchain being used for kind of public or a readily accessible EHR for patients. So
Right.
if I'm a patient, I've got medical records in 16 different health systems across the United States where I've lived, different places. They don't speak to one another. So
Right.
blockchain have that thread all the way through. But for a
How's that
physician,
different though from Epic now, being able to where I am be able to access
it's different. Epic is closed.
I see. So to be able to
This is
talk between
truly
server, Epic, or
truly global.
Eric, I think where it could go too is I think you could actually own your own health record and carry it around with you. And I could bring my health record to you as a
you can do
physician,
that now.
and you could edit it. Then I have to do that in hard copy.
But you don't need blockchain technology to do that.
You don't need
governments.
So it's not.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, but the government is having to step in to force
You just need
healthcare
a
to do
government
it.
to put
So
it-
if you had blockchain in place, the regulations may not need to be in effect to make it happen. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big player in it. And one thing I will say too, I think when blockchain was first coming out, healthcare was looking at it in terms of security
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about, where I work for Children's and our cyber attack, people try to cyber attack us every day. I'm sure Emory's exactly the same way, any healthcare system.
Mhm.
Pediatric records are more valuable on the black market than adult records.
Wow.
So it's a different, because they have a clean credit record. There's no credit. So and a lot of times the kids don't find out about it until
for
they go to
identity theft. It's a-
until they go to college.
Wow.
So blockchain has been looked at in terms of security, but I think that vision has shifted a little bit because I don't know that it would be the next cure to security because I think then you're just fighting a different beast.
Mhm.
So I think no matter what, there's going to the people who want to get a hold of it will try to get a hold of it. But I think in terms of just business process,
Mhm.
the patient record thing is huge, but there's so many business processes that can, just like any other business,
Mhm.
that can totally be impacted by blockchain
Mhm.
and helped with blockchain. So
Right. You had a thought?
No, they mainly still what I was talking about, which is the privacy issues. We've talked about over and over that you need to know that somebody touched your record. The real value is that you know who looked at your record, is that you have the track what people see.
Or edit it. I think that's the
Yeah,
important
that you
part.
could see where people play, anybody who went into your record, you could backtrack and see who's been in there.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts? So we heard patient records, we heard cybersecurity, we heard data sharing, we heard ownership of patient records by the patient itself. We heard challenges like government and regulation. And, well, it's not really a blockchain problem. So, fair point. Did I miss anything? So now we'll look at a journey where we think we are today in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term, what could be the applications. And as you do that, let's separate three things here. We could be talking about blockchain as a technology, what it could do. Then let's also talk about blockchain as a business process and what it forces the inherent participants of that network to do. And then let's talk about drivers of the space, which includes government regulation, but it also includes incentives. It includes incentives of the current state players. And as you look at these three areas, think about not just United States, think about globally, what could be the applications. Because I will tell you, in other fields of blockchain's application, United States is lagging behind. It is not the leader. And I'm saying that on camera, happy to be challenged. There are multiple other places in the world that are much more advanced in not just understanding the technology, that's just table stakes, but actually adopting it and having useful use cases, useful applications that people can then start using. So let's look at some short-term examples here. So as you see this, is there a pointer? Is this a pointer?
Yeah,
Perfect.
red buttons.
Yeah. So the question is really, what is the amount of patient data that's being handled, the number of stakeholders in the process, and what is the scalability in terms of volume, and then amount of control given to patients. So we are going to go from more low-risk applications today, or more low-risk experimentations of blockchain in the healthcare space, to much more higher risk. And I put healthcare records and ownership of a patient record by the patient itself as a much more high-risk proposition, which is much more long-term vision. It's not something that we would accomplish in the next maybe 2 to 3 years. So taking baby steps here. Now, in terms of actual use cases, I'll let you take a look at this. Something as simple as managing provider information. You all know that if the provider information is relayed incorrectly, the insurance company is fined for it. So just a very simple, sort of non-threatening way of introducing the technology for that purpose. And now, when we think about these things, Robbie mentioned something very interesting in the break, if I could bring that up. You want to mention something about database versus blockchain so that we can expand that?
So I was asking if a private blockchain is really a blockchain, because a private blockchain is a database. If you know everybody's in there, that's just a database. But a blockchain to me means that it's anonymized but public. Everybody gets to see everything all the time, but nobody knows who anybody is. And that's the value, is that people can jump and say, this is data for me to help with, but I don't really know who you are or where you're connected to. And a private blockchain is just a database.
So, interesting point of view. There's a lot of confusion around this topic, and today is not the time. If I had more time, I would go into some models that we've drawn about this. But think about two terms: public and private, permission-based and permissionless, right? And then also think about the term database versus blockchain. So let's distinguish them first, and then we'll get to the public-private discussion. To me, what are the basic distinctions? And people try to compare blockchain to databases, which is apples to airplanes comparison. A blockchain should really be compared to business processes that you have created using traditional relational databases. So the challenge is this. Most databases are not encrypted. Blockchain by definition requires the data to be encrypted. Most databases are then tethered with multiple systems across multiple parties that have to reconcile the data back and forth. That's where we spend the money to set up those systems. That's where we have the processes, the automated or a lot of times manual, dysfunctional or disjointed processes. And then we also have this idea of, well, I don't trust your data. So I have to keep reconciling maybe every day, every week, every month, every year, over and over and over again. Meaning databases don't have a shared state amongst multiple parties. A blockchain by definition is a distributed ledger with a shared state. So with that understanding, now let's look at public versus permission-based. There could be all different varieties of public permission-based, or public or private permissionless, private permission-based, etc. So there are 4 combinations here. So to me, they're all different forms of blockchain. It depends on the use case, depends on the industry, what are you trying to create. And given a lot of these use cases, you could see, especially for incumbent enterprises that probably some of you are part of, a permission-based but a private chain makes more sense. Meaning, you know who is part of the network. You vet for somebody to become part of a network. Meaning, you know who is setting up a node and who's setting up a computer, and you also know what data are they able to view and edit. It's not unknown, it's not anonymized in that sense, it's not public in that sense, or sorry, it's not permissionless in that sense. 2, it's private because without your authority, or the authority of this group, called a consortium, or pick a label for it, nobody else could enter it. You wouldn't allow somebody who you don't want it in there. Right? So in that sense, it is a very controlled setup, but the difference is that now let's say we have 10 of these consortium members, or 10 partners in the supply chain, we all have the same network that we share. How's that different from today? You don't have to reconcile.
Yeah, that's
So,
Yes.
so how different is the concept from, if you think about an ecosystem, correct? So an ecosystem that will be connected to different suppliers, different companies that within the same operation connect different databases. Is that basically blockchain? Like if I think about, give you an example, I work for Coca-Cola. So we got the company that basically TCC and the bottlers. We have two different entities, different databases and everything, and there is regulation here, regulation here. We cannot share. So if I think about an ecosystem that would connect that one, is that blockchain? Like if I'm able to put something that it helped me to visualize the data from one side, transactions from one side to another one, and then share it. I'm talking about blockchain.
Yeah, so unless you change the physical infrastructure, it's not blockchain. Right? So what you're talking about is what we do today. We have different systems and we can put a layer of data visualization. But underneath the system, we know that we are reconciling back and forth. We know that it is not a shared state. Right?
Yeah.
So that's just putting lipstick on the pig. When you say a blockchain system, what you mean is you have different nodes that different parties can own, and that's fine, but there is a shared state. There is a consensus mechanism that we agree upon, a set of rules, what data should be included, what should not be included, and at the same time, as soon as the transaction is as soon as the transaction is published, it's visible to everybody at the same time. There is no doubt in anybody's mind what is the state of truth in that moment.
So you're changing the system infrastructure. If I'm looking at system
Exactly.
infrastructure, you have all the databases here, and then you build something on top of those databases and then share it.
No, not build on top of it. Replace it.
Replace it.
Right. So if you build something on top of it, you're still talking about the old way of doing it.
The old way. So now it's basically removing that and then building.
It's a completely new set of infrastructure. And that inherently, therein lies the challenge of adoption.
That's the reason it's so expensive.
It may be so, but so here's the other thing. There's actually, a colleague of mine has done a PhD thesis on this. Look at the transaction costs. You think it's expensive today, but look at the transaction cost of every transaction that you're reconciling back and forth over a length of 30-year period. Right? So now we have moved on to a next evolution. So if you look at the evolution of distributed computing in general, we've gone from centralized, authority-owned system to more what we call cloud today, a distributed set of system. And now we're going to go further distributed to the edge of decentralized systems. And a fully decentralized system would be something called Bitcoin. Oh, sorry, I threw the B word in there. Yes.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but essentially are blockchain systems eliminating the headache of having to have multiple different systems and different platforms integrate with each other?
Yes, thank you. I couldn't have said better.
So that's no, I mean, in my previous life, that was a huge headache of having 17 different systems,
Yes.
not being able to talk to each other, and it was a nightmare.
Exactly.
The data gets lost, there's security issues, et cetera, et cetera. So you're saying your blockchain systems eliminates that entire headache and makes it all just kind of one cohesive.
Absolutely. And think about our entire existence on this planet is based on this particular model. All industries do the same thing. Healthcare being one of them. So imagine the possibilities
Why
now.
don't companies do that? Because that's
Thank
a
you.
no-brainer.
Is it
My
not
job is
a
done.
huge, is it not a huge leap of faith, right? Because you're really then going to something that you haven't used before, and there's not, I mean, as of today, maybe there's more traction and experience and win, but until companies start seeing, and they might be behind, but I would think that a company like UPS, who's been around forever and what they do works and they're making money, it's a huge leap of faith for them to restructure and do everything differently. And who knows, 20 years from now, maybe it's something different.
Yeah.
So it's like you never can be ahead of technology.
Agreed. So
You're
that's
always
part of
chasing the next thing.
So that's part of the classic innovator's dilemma.
Yeah.
Right? You wait for the technology to mature, the market to be mature enough, etc., etc.
But then you're
And that's
behind again. I mean, it's like,
exactly. So that's where you'll see different perspectives from incumbent organizations versus entrepreneurs and visionaries. I had a hand there and there.
Oh, I know the case of a country whose issued a government who issued cryptocurrency,
Mm-hmm.
a plan.
Mm-hmm.
It was really successful. They're planning right now. They're making plans to make it bigger. And I haven't seen any other country doing that. I don't know if you
Yeah, so which country are you?
Uruguay.
Uruguay, okay. So this is slightly off topic from the healthcare subject, but crypto-based currency is being experimented with, my guess is about 10 countries, including Russia, including the United States, in fact. Right, so that idea is not missed on anybody, and that is a major shift in not just viewpoint. I mean, think about it. How long have
they
we...
trade directly with the people as they used to do.
Right, so...
Because this is what my country did. They have public companies, companies which are utility companies owned by the state. So they have great power over people and stuff. So they put money on apps, and everybody interacts with apps with those companies, and so people start paying their bills through the app and stuff. And they issue like a certain amount, and that amount keeps circulating up to right now.
Yeah, that's the future. So here are a couple of predictions. All transactions involving money will eventually be in some form of crypto-based asset. That includes retail transactions, that include trade finance transactions, which are much more volume. We'll talk a little bit more about the data space, but all data that we generate on this planet today will eventually get to some kind of blockchain-based data sharing platform. It is bound to happen inevitably.
Why?
Why?
Why is it bound to happen?
How many of you had the chance to view my TED Talk? I just want to refer it. Okay. So, the current way of storing data is very easy to hack. Just 2 weeks ago, it was Quest Diagnostics was hacked. Right? If you look at the Marriott hack, over 500 million, which is the mother of all hacks. If you look at what's been happening in Facebook last 2 years, you'll understand the extent of this issue. Now let's look at the other side. There's more and more data being generated, more and more devices are coming online, more and more people are coming online. So, and more and more people are generating more and more data. So the problem is being exacerbated and not reduced. We have to find a better model for security. Simple as that. That's point number one. Point number two, I want to jump a little bit into the healthcare space as well.
We've got 5 minutes.
I got you. So I got to land this clip. If you talk about healthcare, let's talk about patient record data, but then also let's talk about wearable data that's coming from all the wearable devices. Let's talk about genomics data, which is a big fascination of mine, and it's a huge area where people want that data to be secure. And not just that, security is one element. People want ownership of that data to where it belongs, which is to the individual. So what has happened is companies have created moats around this data. They use this data, the data that we generate, as a digital asset, and they then monetize it. And we, as consumers, don't get anything out of it. And we are usually on the short end of the stick when a breach happens. So all of these problems point to a different model. We must have a different model. And specifically in the genomic space, you're now looking at platforms being developed, like this one, that require companies to store genomic data on a blockchain-based platform where a consumer, an individual, can have consent and maybe even compensation for their data. And that is going to be the trend in most use cases. One of the drivers would be regulation, so GDPR is a driver. If you start talking about, if you've heard of the Supply Chain Tracking Security Act, Drug Supply Chain Tracking Security Act, some regulation that requires companies to inform you on where this drug came from and to cut out counterfeits, but at the same time, we should be able to know who edited this data potentially or who even read it. And that all is possible with this technology. So the technology is there. The question is of economic drivers, business models, incentives, and regulation. So we'll take one more question and then end the plane. If there's any last thoughts.
Last question. All right, well, thank you very much.